I was first approached with the idea that the Sabbath was to be determined by the moon in fall of 1999 by the Gregorian calendar. And I still remember hearing the concept for the first time and thinking to myself, well, that makes a lot of sense.
The scriptural method of timekeeping is first found in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, beginning at verse 14. There we learn that the lights in the heavens are to be for signs, seasons, days, and years. In short, the sun, moon, and stars are what determine time. And measurement of time, apart from these heavenly bodies, is artificial and thus should not be used in setting any appointments ordained by the Almighty.
What's interesting is that when you look up the word seasons in Genesis 1:14, it's the Hebrew word moedim, and it means appointed times. The same word is used in Psalm 104:19, where the inspired author specifically says that Yahweh appointed the moon for the seasons, or for the moedim. And when it comes to yearly or monthly appointments like Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles, or even the new moon, people have no problem believing Psalm 104:19. Yet when it comes to the weekly appointment, they aren't so quick to accept that the moon has something to do with determining when the weekly Sabbath is.
Many readers of Scripture, including ourselves in the past, glance over Leviticus 23, 1 through 3, where the weekly Sabbath day is listed as the very first feast of Yahweh. The word feasts in verse 2 of this chapter is the Hebrew word moedim, the same word used in Genesis 1:14 and Psalm 104:19. In other words, the weekly Sabbath is the first appointment in the list of all the appointed times. Does it then make sense for every appointment in Leviticus 23, verse 4 and following, to be determined by the moon, but the primary appointment that heads the list is not?
When the Lunar Sabbath was first presented to me, I was already observing the new moon on the first day of the scriptural lunar month. I was observing it as set apart to the Father, and I was also observing the annual festivals by the lunar cycle. And I remember asking myself this question: if I'm keeping all of the other set apart times by Yahweh's lesser light in the heavens, that is the moon, why am I looking to another calendar to observe His weekly appointment? It didn't make scriptural sense to me then, and it doesn't make scriptural sense to me now. And my children have never been taught any other Sabbath timing. I cannot imagine trying to convince them to forsake Yahweh's natural timekeeping as found in the heavens and opt for a day that I cannot honestly prove to them is the seventh day of the week.
While the moon will be mentioned often in this film, it is not the only light in the heavens that determines time. Genesis 1:14 through 18 clearly mentions lights, plural, both greater and lesser. Psalm 136, 7 through 9, and Jeremiah 31, 35 through 36 show that these lights are the sun, moon, and stars. Yahweh's method of timekeeping is to be found within His natural creation. Nothing about it is artificial. So let's briefly cover how much more logical and scriptural sense Yahweh's calendar makes over and above artificial, man-made timekeeping. Our current Gregorian calendar in America begins the year in the middle of winter. The grass is not growing and the sap is down in the trees. This man-made new year is named after the Roman god Janus, a god with two faces, one to take out the old year and one to bring in the new. Janus was the god of gates and doors, which swing both ways, and was worshipped at birthdays, weddings, and funerals. He was often depicted with the number 300 in one hand and the number 65 in the other. Yahweh's New Year begins around the spring equinox. When the weather begins to warm, the grass begins to grow, and the leaves come back on the trees. In other words, everything is coming anew all over again. Yahweh gives us a signal in the heavens with His Son at this equinox, and new life is birthed in nature once again. What about the months of the Gregorian calendar? Some are 31 days in length, while others are 30. February is 28 days long, but sometimes in what's called a leap year, 29 days long. Who decided these months would have a particular number of days in them? Is there anything in the heavenly lights of Genesis 1 that tells us January has 31 days and February only 28? Yahweh's months are lunar. Even our English word month stems from the word moon. We still speak of a newlywed couple going on their honeymoon, originally the first month or moon of their marriage. Lunar months are either 29 or 30 days in length. This is due to the fact that from one new moon to another is about 29.5 days. Yahweh, not man, decides how many days are in each lunar month. If you and I were out camping and at 12 a.m., midnight, I tapped you on the arm and said, "Hey, a new day just began," what is there in the heavens or in nature to prove me correct? Who decided that days end and begin at 12 a.m.? It most certainly was not Yahweh. Yahweh's days end and by default begin at evening or sunset. The sun rules by day and then sets, and we have the moon and the stars ruling the night. Yahweh even commands that His set-apart days be observed from evening to evening. We submit to you that the week is also found in the heavens, or in Yahweh's natural creation. There is nothing in Yahweh's heavenly lights that teach us Sunday begins a week and Saturday ends a week. We can't look at His created nature and come to that conclusion. What does exist right within the lesser light, the moon, is a new moon and 4 weekly cycles. It is no coincidence that the moon cycles in almost exact 7-day intervals, 7.3 to be exact. After the new moon, you count to 7 and you have the first quarter. Count another 7 and you come to the full moon. Count another 7 and you come to the last quarter. Your last count to 7 brings you to the last sliver of the moon before arriving at the new moon all over again. In Romans 1 and 1 Corinthians 11, the Apostle Paul writes about nature teaching us concepts. This is fact, because if nature teaches us something, it is Yahweh teaching us because He created and designed nature. If we believe measurements of time like the year, month, and day are all found in Yahweh's creation, why then do we rely on an arbitrary count for our week and thus our Sabbath? If you and I agree that Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is on the 10th day of the 7th month, and then I try to keep Yom Kippur on July the 10th, would you correct me? Why? Well, you would explain that it was on the 10th day of the 7th month by Yahweh's calendar. See, many Sabbath keepers are looking for and finding a 7th day, but they are looking for that 7th day in the wrong place.
I think that we were timely in accepting this mission of going to the moon.
The concept of the Sabbath being determined by the lunar cycle is not difficult, especially if you are familiar with lunar months in Scripture. The new moon is the first day of each month, a worship day that is not to be classified in with the 6 working days. It is a day on which the ancient Israelites met together to worship Yahweh and refrain from commercial activity. After celebrating the new moon, you then work for 6 days and rest the 7th. Seeing there are at least 29 days in a lunar cycle, You have 4 weeks of 7 days in each lunar cycle. The weekly Sabbath is kept on each 7th day per the commandment in Exodus 28 through 11. The key here is that the new moon is not counted when counting these weeks. The new moon is day 1, followed by an additional 28 days or 4 weekly cycles. This places the weekly Sabbaths on the 7th day of each week, but on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th days of each month.
The primary scripture that I go to when showing people that the new moon is not to be counted as one of the 6 work days is Ezekiel 46 verse 1, which begins by saying, "Thus saith the sovereign Yahweh." Some people wonder why jump to a prophetic text, but it's Yahweh that's speaking, and he says that there's a gate that is to be shut on the 6 work days, but open on the Sabbath and the day of the new moon. Now, to my knowledge, there's not a single person on the planet that believes that the Sabbath can fall on one of the 6 work days. Yet the new moon is mentioned in the exact same context, in the exact same verse, breath, we might say, as the weekly Sabbath. So if the weekly Sabbath cannot fall on one of the 6 work days, which everyone agrees with, why then do we believe that the new moon, which is mentioned in the same sentence as the Sabbath, as distinct from the work days, why do we believe that it can fall on one of the 6 work days? When you understand that the new moon is separate from the 6 work days, everything else falls into play.
At this point, Exodus 28 through 11 is usually cited with the argument that there must always be 6 days between Sabbaths. At first glance, this poses a problem to the lunar Sabbatarian. Seeing that scriptural lunar months are sometimes 30 days in length, this places either 7 or 8 days between weekly Sabbaths. They reason that after the last lunar Sabbath on the 29th day of the month, you will either have an additional day 30 or day 1 of the next month. In view of the opposition, this violates the commandment to work 6 days and rest on the 7th.
You know, I've always been amazed at how anti-lunar Sabbath proponents harp on us for sometimes having more than 6 days between weekly Sabbaths, and yet they don't think about, generally, that they will sometimes have less than 6 work days between weekly Sabbaths. For instance, all through the year, every time a feast rolls around, it will break up their 6 work days before their 7th day Sabbath. And so if they're going to harp on work 6 days, rest the 7th, work 6 days, rest the 7th, then why do they, throughout the year, have times when they do not work 6 days before resting the 7th?
When keeping the Sabbath by a continuous count of 1 through 7 and the monthly and yearly appointments by the moon, there will be many times in a scriptural year where you will not have 6 working days between weekly Sabbaths. For example, the new moon will usually happen on Sunday through Friday. In such cases, there are only 5 working days. Seeing the new moon is not a working day per Ezekiel 46 verse 1. You will also have the annual festivals all roll around once a year, and they will break up the cycle of working 6 days and resting the 7th as well. That is, if you opt for a continuously uninterrupted 7-day week.
I think we should look at the command to work 6 days and rest the 7th as a general rule rather than a hard, fast rule. Most of the time, you will work 6 days and rest the 7th. But there's a time at the end of each lunar cycle where Yahweh renews the moon, and you have more than 6 days between weekly Sabbaths. Not more than 6 days where you may do all your work, but nonetheless more than 6 days. To me, I feel that's more scriptural than having times throughout the year when you have less than 6 days before you rest on a 7th day Sabbath, which is what you have when you keep the Sabbath every Friday evening to Saturday evening.
I knew that our Bible, this one, was written on the lunar calendar. Our calendar, the Western civilization calendar, is the Gregorian calendar from Pope Gregory of Rome. That means it's pagan in origin. It's not God's calendar. Our calendar and the calendar of this book do not match. Sun God is for Sunday. Moon God is for Monday. That's a sermon for another time. Believe me, much of what Christianity salutes is pagan to its roots.
Understanding the sanctity of the day of the new moon will aid greatly in understanding the concept of the Sabbath being regulated by the moon. We have already shown from the mouth of Yahweh in Ezekiel 46:1 that neither Sabbath or new moon are to be classified in with the 6 working days. But there are many other texts in Scripture showing that the new moon is not just a day to recognize and then go on as though there is nothing special about it. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 66, 22 through 23, we find that not only will worship in the new heavens and new earth be from Sabbath to Sabbath, it will also be from new moon to new moon. Notice how the new moon is mentioned as a worship day, right along with the Sabbath. In the book of Numbers, chapter 28, verses 11 through 15, we see that the sacrificial offerings for the new moon are not the same as the regular daily offerings during the 6 working days. Special or extra offerings signify a special day. Numbers 10 verse 10 also speaks of blowing both silver trumpets on the day of the new moon, something that was to be done for the calling of the assembly according to Numbers 10 verses 2 through 3. In 2 Kings 4:23, we see that it was out of the ordinary for a person to visit with a prophet on the 6 working days. The text teaches that these occasions were generally reserved for the Sabbath or the new moon. Notice how the new moon keeps coming up in the same context as the weekly Sabbath. Most people have not realized that almost the entire book of Deuteronomy was a new moon sermon preached by Moses. Deuteronomy 1 verse 3 tells us that on the first day of the 11th month, in the 40th year in the wilderness, Moses spoke to the Israelites all that Yahweh had commanded. Even Paul in Colossians 2:16 recognized the holiness of the day of the new moon when he writes, "Let no man judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of an holy day, new moon, or Sabbath." Holy day would be the yearly appointments, Sabbath would be the weekly appointment, and the new moon would be the monthly appointment. Paul lists the new moon in with the holy days and Sabbaths because it too is a day that is set apart from a regular working day. According to Amos 8 verse 5, commerce in Israel stopped not only on the Sabbath, but also on the new moon. The greedy, sinful traders of the land asked themselves, "When will the new moon be gone, that we may sell corn, and the Sabbath that we may set forth wheat?" The reason they could not sell corn or wheat on the new moon and Sabbath is because the faithful Israelites would not buy it on the new moon or Sabbath. This lets us know that these Hebrews observed the new moon as a day of no buying or selling. The enormous amount of scriptural evidence has led even prominent Christian authors to include the sanctity of the new moon in their writings or commentary. In spite of the mound of scriptural evidence in favor of the new moon not being one of the 6 working days, many are still not convinced and make a fervent effort to lessen the sanctity of the new moon to a point where it really ceases to be much different at all from a regular working day. They say that that's talking about the 7th new moon. That's usually the common objection. That's only talking about the 7th new moon. I believe that's eisegesis rather than exegesis. They're reading into a text something that it does not say. They jump to Leviticus 23, 24 through 25, which does speak of the 7th new moon, Yom Teruah in Hebrew, which is a special new moon of the year, no doubt. It's in a special month. But you can't copy and paste Leviticus 23 over into the context of Amos 8, verse 5, where it doesn't mention the 7th new moon. It just mentions new moon and Sabbath, similar to Isaiah 66, Ezekiel 46, 2 Kings 4:23, and Colossians 2:16. Those are the parallel texts with Amos 8. If Amos 8 was only talking about the seventh new moon and none other, he could have said it. Leviticus 23:24 specifically mentions the first day of the seventh month, and another text would be like Nehemiah 8:1-3. It specifically mentions the first day of the seventh month, which Amos 8:5 doesn't. It's much easier to understand. Amos 8:5 is talking about the appointment that rolls around about once a month at the beginning of each scriptural lunar month.